Thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody here. Thank you to the Arbor Centre for hosting this event, and thank you for your fortitude and your persistence in making this happen. In between, I think, when we first spoke and this happening today, my years of experience have gone from 37 to 40 now, so good on you. Just a quick show of hands, just getting a sense of the makeup of the room. Who here is from local government or some government areas, etc.? Okay, all right, that's really interesting to know. A large proportion. Private sector consulting or similar, small number, yep. And construction, a couple. Okay, all right. So a large part of you here are from local government, so very clearly I think some of these things that we'll be speaking about today, myself and many other speakers, will be addressing potential game changers, whether it's a case of maybe picking up some old practice and reinvigorating it, or perhaps identifying new practice and looking at how that can be made to work within our current frameworks. Now, I'll start here today with really a broader scene setting. So even though, as Rob was saying, most of the conference here today will be dealing with questions of medium density, high density, how do you deal with maximising tree cover and tree retention in most probably inner urban areas and similar. There's a lot where we're also tackling the same issues on the fringes in Greenfield, because they are also the places where we're seeing medium density come to town as well. In my presentation, I'll be covering off both a mixture of just broader, higher principles or some issues. I won't be doing the deep dive into policy frameworks, but rather just touching on the consequence or what the outcome is of some of those frameworks. Those 1,000 cuts that are seeing us lose so much canopy within our urban areas. But then I'll also just dive into one or two micro elements, because I often find myself, it's great to hear the broad picture, but hang on, there wasn't anything quite specific and meaty that I could get my teeth into as well. So I'll try to cover off a little bit of both of those things today. So I guess one of the first things, it's important to just emphasise that I think all of us in the practice in delivering communities, environments, etc., we're all aiming to focus on optimising today sustainability and environmental outcomes. Achieving that is often really quite challenging. We would all love to see every box ticked in terms of projects being able to deliver on every one of the key aspects that we want to achieve those sustainability and environmental outcomes. In reality, very often it might be a paper, scissors, rock outcome. One tends to trump the other, or one extinguishes the opportunity to do the other, etc. So depending on what you prioritise, you might have different outcomes and you might have some losses along the way. I always find it valuable when looking at our current practice in greenfield development, and the same applies to infill and medium density, to look at where we've come from. And as much as we tend to think quite correctly in most regards that we do have a lot of best practice environmental and sustainability standards, I do, because of those 40 years, I do go back and look at what I was working on, literally, 35 years ago, which there's an image of one of those on the left-hand side, that's Woodvale, and there's an image of a fairly typical contemporary project on the right-hand side. And we weren't necessarily always endeavouring to achieve best environmental practice back then, But gosh, we were actually delivering on pretty good environmental practice even without trying. That image on the left is not a photograph of a proposed or a parkland area within the estate. That's actually the private lots that were being sold. For those of us who also have grey hair in the audience, you might remember that most land development involved scraping and constructing the roads. If you had to remove a tree, you'd remove a tree. If you didn't have to remove a tree, you didn't take out a tree. You pretty much kept to contours. Surveyors put the pegs in the ground for the lot boundaries, and the developer sold the lots like that. Then it all went pear-shaped after the community, after residents or purchasers bought it, and it was usually them that cleared the lots and the builders building on their behalf. But practice back then, several decades ago, was actually already retaining tree canopy just as a normal part of the course. And I will do a bit of a deep dive into some of the reasons why that was working a little bit later, and maybe some of the lessons we can bring back again. Before I do the deep dive, I'll just cover off maybe a few of the reasons why we're seeing increased urban canopy loss within Greenfield, and I know much of this also still applies to infill and medium density as well. I'll cover each one of these very briefly in passing. The first one, smaller lots. We're all familiar with these sort of images, and this is one of the drivers for responses that we're seeing now from the department, from DPLH, to look at some recalibrated design codes like medium density codes to avoid overbuilding, which originally was the intent of the R codes if you go back to the 1980 editions, but it's been lost along the way. But we're also seeing a unholy trend of not just the smaller lots, that can be quite sustainable and logical in many places and is, but at the same time as lots have become smaller, houses have become bigger, and of course the amount of curtilage around them has shrunk. I'll touch on briefly in a second, but these are things that are in the attention of the department and various other players, and there are actions afoot to try to recalibrate some of these settings. I will observe, though, that often the reason why, in fact, a lot of community members moving into these suburbs claim they can't have trees is they will say there's not enough space for trees there, and often that is the case. But if you go back to some of the old areas like East Perth, for example, where you're looking at the same size blocks, you're actually seeing that there can be sometimes a fair bit of canopy in there. That shot is, of course, a very short front setback. It's only about 4 metres. They're about 8 or 10 metre wide blocks, and you can see there's quite a few trees that have been planted in the front verges or the front gardens of those blocks in East Perth. This is the same scale of product we're seeing in areas like Alkimos, but what's driving somebody in East Perth to plant trees and somebody in Alkimos maybe not to? That's an interesting question. Maybe goes to community values as they stand now. Perhaps there's not enough love of trees in the community. Maybe that's something we've got to be working on. Flat lots and retaining, that's a hard nut to crack. It evolved from the 1980s into the 1990s and beyond partly as a response to dealing with coastal development, the dunal development that was very difficult otherwise to build on unless you reshaped extensive areas of jumbled dunal landscapes. But it became so successful through some developers, particularly with the partnerships they were establishing with builders, that this became almost the default setting for development in almost any location. Popular with builders, why? Because they're getting an easy to build on site straight away. Prior to this, every block, remember that shot of the blocks with trees on them? A builder on every block would need to first send in the bobcats, clear off the trees and do some cut to fill within the block itself. This made the job easy for them. So this is why the practice has emerged, but also it's now been ensconced in a lot of our policy settings. We don't tolerate cross-lot drainage most of the time, for example, which is what you used to get when blocks maybe were sloping one to the next. And I'll note here that's just a shot of what you sometimes got in some of those older subdivisions. That's Duncraig, and where the lots weren't benched in the first place, and you can see there's a tree there that's very clearly older than the subdivision that's been retained. Rigid street grids and orientation. We're now connecting up all of our streets quite properly to maximise walkability. We're now, for a sustainability outcome, we're starting to aim to reorientate streets and blocks so that they're fairly well orientated from a solar perspective, more or less on the cardinal. That actually delivers best energy efficiency for the dwellings built. What it doesn't do is it doesn't work with natural landform and natural landscape, because it might be that the site that you started with doesn't necessarily oblige itself to that orientation. Maybe to work with contours you actually had to have different street orientations. And the other thing too I'll make mention is that when streets are fully connected, when we've got grids, that means the grade from one street to another, all of them need to meet certain grade requirements. So that it's a lot harder than it used to be to actually do really big drops between certain locations, because we now need to maintain even grades almost in all directions. And so consequently we see a lot of this sort of thing happening. For example, you can see that area there. Grades are being maintained between that street and that street, and you can see the consequence of the fill that's required to achieve that. What did we do before? Well, when we disconnected streets a little bit more, we still can under livable neighbourhoods. Some 10% of streets can be cul-de-sacs. Not that that's an aspirational direction, but if the job requires perhaps a little bit of level shift, why not use that? And here you've got examples. This is Craigie, and you've got some massive level differences from one street to another. That's over probably about 70 metres rather than the conventional 60 metres today, but there's probably a fall of about 5 or 6 metres between the two streets there. That's a lot harder to achieve today. And so if you don't have to change your landform, then you don't have to remove trees. That's the constant point here. Bushfire, well, we all know that through bushfire regs we need to ensure that our interfaces with fire risk locations demand greater setbacks, rigid controls in terms of planting that happens within those setback areas. For example, that huddle of houses in the middle is protected by that a 20 metre wide road reserve right around. You can see in that image there. So all of that cleared land around that's the carriageway there is actually still road reserve, and of course the canopy and vegetation within that area has to be strictly managed so that you don't unintentionally create a fire hazard. So those sort of things are also just making the job a little bit harder to retain and incorporate and include urban canopy. Subdivision and residential codes. One of the things that's coming out of the new medium density code that's really relevant to the conversations here is the big push for deep root zones and private garden areas to be mandated. And what that's going to result in is either some redesign of contemporary dwelling forms. Villa forms might need to be a little bit more efficient, for example, rethink maybe the use of corridors and rather have openings directly to living areas, because that, as you can see there, for example, that one corridor could actually become part of a garden instead. So there are ways in which you can be much smarter with house design, or you can go up 2 stories or be more modest. But that's a really significant initiative that the department, that DPLH are pursuing right now. I should also say that, again, a lot of the rules and guidelines around dealing with medium density development in a contemporary situation, particularly in a green field, a green title situation, often results in those examples that I showed before, benching, clearing, all of those sorts of things. It doesn't have to be the case. This is a project we did, Fraser's Landing down near Mandurah. That's actually a medium density project. We retained bushland in the middle of that. The dwellings come right up to the edge of that. We don't have any significant retaining other than within the buildings themselves. It's achievable primarily because there was strata titles, so a different set of rules could be used. So that's the invisible hand of governance frameworks in terms of what they either prevent or enable, depending on what you're exploring. Risk and liability, well, we can imagine that, with a lot of contemporary development, if we're incorporating canopy within medium density, there is always going to be a perception of risk needing to be dealt with. These trees, these are in Mount Lawley in a villa development, R40 villa development, and they are still there. They're still there. They haven't been removed, but you can see it'll only take eventually one strata owner to claim that that's a risk, and for then either a risk assessment to be made, or perhaps simply the strata body fires up the chainsaws and takes it out, and that's often what happens. I'd make a note of the risk assessment that we tend to apply to trees is very different to the risk assessment we apply to other things, such as, for example, road safety. And in fact, if you applied the same risk assessment methodology to the driveway in this image as to the trees, you'd probably have to shut down the driveway because it's a high risk tomorrow. So we tend to have a very unforgiving set of standards for risk assessment related to trees, not unforgiving when it relates to other things such as road design, etc. The final one that I'll actually cover in more depth now is drainage design and bulk earthworks. And I know that Shelley is going to be speaking about drainage design in particular in the next session. And I'm hoping there's probably not too much clashing between our messaging. I think there's some overlap and we'll see how that goes. But drainage design, going back again to similar to those early images I showed of old practice and contemporary practice, the image on the left is open space with a really major drainage component within it. That's in Duncraig. That was developed around 1980. Image on the right is in Alkimos. It's actually one of our projects, but it's what we've got to do. Similar size drainage component, but this is the result of how we needed to design and deliver, and I'll explain why the difference is. Why could we retain so much canopy some decades ago, and it's almost impossible to do that today? And the message that I want to be driving is that not that we should be throwing out contemporary practice at all. It's simply to say, look, we've got a very limited toolkit, and it makes a lot of sense. Just bring in a couple of other tools to use on the right job. So I'll be coming back to that message, but it's not a case of saying we've got it wrong. It's just a case of saying sometimes where the site demands, maybe we need to have another look at a different approach to get a better outcome. So the key message I wanted to just quickly explore here is how drainage design has evolved over the last 30 years or thereabouts. Back in the early days when I was practicing, drainage pretty much just went into sumps, and I'll explain in a minute how they were allocated, but they were basically holes in the ground. Steep-sided, maximum angle of repose, 1 and 3, but they held huge volumes and they had a relatively small area, so they had a minimal impact in terms of surrounding context. We then looked at, as we evolved into the 90s, and almost as a precursor to LN, we looked at initiatives to start integrating drainage with naturalistic swales and make them part of the open space delivery. Initially, that was done often working with almost quite naturalistic landforms and landscapes. That means if you had some undulations, or if you were creating some what I'd call soft basins, you could roll land into them and then out of them, or maybe just even keep land as it almost was, without change. What it did do, though, and when we achieved this, we actually got almost a perfect blend between drainage accommodation, landform retention and canopy retention. That was actually the halcyon day, pretty much then. Since then, again, going back to that question of risk and liability, we're now also looking at how do you minimise the risk of, particularly to kids, of water bodies that might have more than about 500 mil depth in them. So the consequence of that means that you go to much shallower, flatter drainage areas, which comply with that requirement, comply with that standard. They're much safer because they're only knee-high for us, and they're manageable for kids. But as you can see from that image there, if that wasn't the shape of your land to start with, you might actually have to do the really ironic thing of actually filling the bottom of the valley to bring it up to the baseline of that drainage site. And of course, whenever you fill and cut, you lose trees, you lose landform. So that safety requirement then cascades into this implication. So it sounds, when I describe this, it sounds as if they're all pretty much, one thing or another, the same, but just slightly different shape. But there is a land take implication, and I'll explain why. The image on the left is really just a 3D representation of what we used to do, the old sumps. That might be about 5 metres deep. The sequence on the right is just taking that same sump in its 500 mil slices and then rearranging them flat. So that the image on the right is the composite effect of taking the same volume and putting it into something that's going to be compliant today. So the implication there is what used to be a hole in the ground actually now has a much larger land take. And if your natural land that you're going to be imposing it on is undulating, well-treed, etc., it might mean that they have to go. It might mean that you have to recontour the land to achieve that outcome. It might mean that you have to take the trees out and replant afterwards. So there's not always necessarily a bad outcome, but you do lose the chance of maybe retaining what was there in the first place. Here's an example of that happening. This is quite a small drainage area. It's in a project we did called Viventi, south of the river. And working from right to left, that's a shot pre-development when we did our landscape inspections. And that's just looking down this particular track along there. That area there is about the middle part there. That was because there was part of the lower part of the land. It makes sense to take drainage there, and it looked like a good opportunity because it wasn't too undulating to try to maximise tree cover in there at the same time. But the depth of drainage in the middle there, probably at 100-year event, might have been up to 3 metres or something like that because of the size of that space. So the consequence was exactly what I described before. Ironically, it had to be filled to bring up the base to a level where you can maintain safe depths all the way through, and of course you can see what the casualty was. It's not the intention of those controls to deliver that outcome, but it's an unintended consequence that we sometimes get. And I'll just also explain the difference from old practice to new practice in terms of what it meant, not only for the drainage sites themselves, but what it meant to the cascading implications to bulk earthworks. So it's hard to find a best practice case study recent, because we just don't do it that old way any longer. So I had to go back and just look at an old suburb, Duncraig here, to illustrate what happened there. So we can see in that aerial photograph, that's the area that you can see depicted in this contour map. For those who are used to reading contours, of course these are the contours there denoting progressive height levels as we move through. They've been colour-coded from the bluish green at the lowest levels through to the red at the highest level. So from that map you can actually see what the land shape is doing. And when I look back at what the planner for this estate would have done, I can see that the drainage went into those natural low points here and here and captured in a natural low point some drainage that was coming down from the left-hand side there. Those blue dots are, although they're schematic on this image, they're about correct in terms of the size of the actual deep swales or sumps they put into the site in this location. So the blue dots there represent what the drainage provision was in this part of Duncraig at that time. If we were to run a hypothetical and say, well, what would we do today if we applied our contemporary standards? And that's what the drainage would become. It'd become those areas that I've highlighted in blue. And you can see that it, obviously, we're maximising water-sensitive urban design by maximising infiltration, a lot of other things in there. But, and I'll show you a couple of slides of what those actual sites look like. Before and after, it's clear that any vegetation there would have been gone through development. So you can see there, they actually do contain vegetation. All of that vegetation is pre-development vegetation. They're the old Marri, Jarrah, Tuarts in that part of Duncraig. So having a quick look at what's there, that was the central, I'll just point them out. There's one central drainage area here, northwest there, and a western one here. I'll just quickly show you what they looked like. So that's, oops, my apologies, that's the central one, and within it, that's the drainage accommodated there. Pretty deep and ugly sump, and they don't have to be ugly. I'll get to that later. But you can see that was the extent of impact, and we retained vegetation here, and that's what that area looks like today. Pretty much the same as it was when it was first developed. On the western edge, that's that parkland with retained vegetation and a sump tucked in there. And the northern one, of course, it's the sump tucked in there, and of course the natural shape of the land's been retained, and the tree cover retained in that site. Today, again, that's probably what the outcome would have been if we had to do that today. Is that all bad? Well, look, like I say, it gets replanted, and this is probably what the postcard shots of water-sensitive urban design today look like. It's been the recontoured project with replanted vegetation. So that's just an illustration of what does it actually mean when we use some of the wider water-sensitive, just some of the wider, safer drainage sites in landscape. But there's also another implication, that's to earthworks. So if I can point out, okay, that's that central drainage site right there. It didn't require alteration to contours. I know that you probably can't see it at all, but from that side there we go 1, 2, 3, 4 metres up to the surrounding streets, and then we jump the better part of another metre to the first blocks back there. Now, if it was that the whole of that site needed to be either cut or filled or do something, with it, it's very unlikely that we would have finished off at natural contours of the boundary. We would have already started digging into that hillside to the tune of about 4 metres, and then we just keep digging for about the next 200 or 300 metres until we daylight out again at appropriate grades. And of course, every tree, every bit of veg along the way goes in that process. In reality, what in this estate you see is that's some retained veg just across the road from that Central Park. That was just offshot there. 100 metres up the street is this tree that was retained. Going the other direction, a couple of 100 metres up the street, these chorts retained there as well. Now, that's not so much a question of just, the benching versus non-benching. It's actually a question of the bulk earthworks and the road design that happens in between. Because let's just work on the basis. It'd be great if we can actually move away from the benching scenario, but let's just work on the basis that particularly with medium density, we're going to have benching, we're going to have a loss of cover on blocks themselves. So where do we actually want to try to retain canopy? Wherever possible, at least in the roads. But if we're cutting roads into landscape, then we've lost that opportunity, except for any trees that we're planting in afterwards. So that's that illustration there of having perhaps cut out to a certain level at one point, and you keep chasing that contour uphill. And what it looks like when you're doing a land development is you might start off with identifying areas with best trees, best landform, and incorporate that into a plan, pick out where the drainage might need to go. Then the process that we normally go through is that we sit down with the consulting engineers. They work out the drainage catchments regime that needs to be applied under the current standards. They do a cut to fill. So the red and the blue represent the cut to fill areas. The white is the only areas left untouched. So what we were finding on that plan, for example, is that most of the open space had to be cut or filled. In fact, what we ended up doing was redesigning to at least match the open space to the bits that didn't have to be cut or filled in that process. So it becomes quite a problematic issue, problematic exercise. And that's because we're actually reshaping wider catchments to fall into now much larger drainage configurations. I'll just go back to this slide here. One of the points I'd like to make is that old school practice of dropping in sumps, some of the first projects I worked on, again, where we're not changing a landform at all, an engineer, instead of recutting landform, would have a look at the plan, and often the sumps might go into actually a residential block on the street run. And the engineer would simply say, okay, that block, and that block, they come out, sump goes in there, job is done, you don't need to earthwork anything else. So it was a case of, and you might end up having 3 or 4 sumps in an area, but they all worked pretty efficiently and they didn't have a cascade implication either. Today we might actually bring that back down to 1 or 2 drainage areas, but because you're bringing everything down to that 1 or 2, you need to reshape. That was the explanation for why we're looking at this sort of practice sometimes. So that's pretty much close to end, and sounds like close to time as well. So again, just getting back to that message, this last bit of banging on wasn't a case of good old days, let's go back to sumps at all. It's actually a case of simply saying, sometimes if you've got a really great piece of land, and if you're going to cause more damage than the benefit you get out of it, it might be useful to look at a contemporary version of some of other practices that might be able to help you retain landscape, retain landform, retain trees. So it's really a case of another tool in that toolkit rather than just relying on 1 or 2 approaches. And again, just a couple of closing shots. The sumps that I showed you in the previous slides were pretty ugly and dirty. On that left-hand image there is a sump. Actually, I went back to that. That's an old subdivision I did in Mandurah back in the mid-80s, and the City of Mandurah has clearly planted that sump with trees. And even though the sump is fenced for safety in theory, and I think Shelley will talk about the safety question as well, but at least the sump now contains a great amount of tree canopy. But it is that same question of you didn't retain it inside the sump, but through planting afterwards. The one on the right-hand side is just in the middle of a street median that's opposite the children's hospital. This is White Gum Valley. This is a kind of hybrid. This is an old sump which couldn't be enlarged to match with contemporary practice, but was modified by, I think, Atlanta cells or similar, which took some of the preliminary volume or bulk volume during drainage events, but also still had a fair bit of storage capacity above, and it used various clever techniques in terms of dealing with liability, information and depth issues, such as the height measure log on the right hand side of that image, and likewise sometimes it's possible to incorporate those deeper swales into project areas and separate out some of the bioretention function, maybe not necessarily in that same location, it might be upstream. So even though I didn't touch on nutrient retention and biofilters, etc., they can go hand in hand. It's the large volumes I'm talking about are just the big volumes you've got to deal with. So again, just going back to that first question, specialist tools, I think it's going to be a theme that comes up through the course of the day, and that there's a need to really look at either old practice or new innovations to get right outcomes for a lot of projects moving forward. So thank you very much.